Today I want to talk about the reality of the South African agriculture sector, agro-processing, and the process of planning. We've had many plans in the sector. Recently, we've had the 5-year sector plan. This process was introduced by President Ramaphosa, requesting industry to come up with a plan that illustrates public-private partnerships. This plan was submitted to government, and in this process we actually have moved into what we now refer to as the agriculture master plan. This is a plan that's not only done for agriculture, but many other sectors in the South African economy. This plan is done in collaboration between DTI and the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform, Rural Development. And what we are responsible for on the BFAB side is looking at research into collaboration with the NIMC and the department. So what I want to present today are the different pillars of growth that we see in the sector, and this links to the National Development Plan. And then I want to talk about how do we put all of this together in a master plan? What's our understanding of a master plan, and how do we really need a plan that's executable, where we have real action? The first principle that we have to do in this master plan is we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's so much information out there. There are so many examples, and that's the one benefit. If people ask me, are we in a better space than we were 20 years ago? And I would argue, yes, we are. Yes, the economy is in a worse state. We have less cash in the coffers. We are running a bigger deficit, but what we do have are good examples of where things have worked, where public-private partnerships have contributed to growth, where we have created jobs, where we have examples of government and industry working together to open up exports, to open up markets, new interventions, new investments in the industry. So what I want to talk about are the 3 pillars of growth. And these are the ones that we also addressed in the National Development Plan, and they are still relevant. We just need to narrow them down and provide more active guidance and create ownership of who's going to do what. And that's how a normal business plan works. So the first pillar of growth remains the underutilized land and unused land, and there are vast tracts of land that we have available. There's good GIS information out there, remote sensing. We know where those areas are. We know what the potential of that soil is. We know what we can grow there. We understand what the lack of infrastructure is in those areas. What we need to do is put that information together and create an integrated plan. What we also can have a better understanding of is what are the consumption hubs in those areas. And I'm specifically talking about rural informal value chains. We don't understand what's happening in those chains. They do exist. Current estimates, best estimates, are around 30%, 35% of our food runs through these informal value chains. And I think the recent examples that we have with COVID-19, where we've shut down some of those informal chains, the bucky traders, has quickly learned us a lesson how important these value chains are. Whether it's meat, vegetables, fruits, we need these informal value chains. So let's go and find out and research these value chains and understand what do they require. They don't need that much more regulation that's going to drive up costs. What they do need is infrastructure, credit. They need a market to supply their produce. And this is what we need to put together. The same goes for smallholder farmers. Let's be honest, we have a good agriculture census, a new census, but we're only looking at VAT-registered farmers. After 20 years, we still don't have a comprehensive farm registry of smallholder farmers. What type of credit do they need? What type of loans, extension services? What is their need? How can we make them sustainable? And this is again the good news. There are a number of initiatives under the Jobs Fund and many more where we have examples where we've created actually commercial farmers. We have to be realistic about the sector. These are smallholders. Small revenues are generated on farming. We need to be honest that we cannot dump these farmers into poverty. We need to support them, and they have a very critical role to play in rural economies. A lot of these farmers, and I want to get back to the principle of the first pillar, there's a huge amount of potential, and we need to unlock this potential. A lot of this potential also hinges on the security of tenure. Do you have security of tenure of the land that you're farming on? Will you invest in this farming operation? If you have security of tenure, in whichever way, and there are good examples of new innovative ways, not only title deeds, we have other models as well that we've looked at and that are presented out there. Let's drive some of those innovative models to get security going, where we can have investments, where finances can run, and you actually grow a rural economy. And again, as I've mentioned, we've got a number of examples in this sector. Secondly, we want to look at the high value export opportunities. Now, these specifically relate to fruits and meat. But what happens is, if you focus on meat exports, you're already creating a drive for the derived demand for grains, soybeans, yellow maize. So what you're doing, you're creating this very, very long integrated value chain. And I'll talk about the integrated value chains in a moment. But just focusing on the export-led high-value commodities. What do we need in those sectors? We want to have bigger markets. We need to focus on bilateral trade agreements. If we compare our position to countries like Chile, Australia, who are competing on wines, Chile on fruit, and many more competitors out there in the world, a lot of times they have more preferential export agreements or entering into major markets like China compared to our agreements. Again, we have good examples where we have had big success, but I think here we need big capacity in government and in industry working together and driving bilateral trade agreements. We know it will take time, and we need to focus. We need to stagger this and identify key areas where we actually need to go first and get these actions moving. And as I've mentioned, the bigger we can drive these initiatives, our local market won't be able to absorb all of our produce. And this is actually good news. We need to not try and say we don't want to focus on export markets, and we're not only going to focus on export markets or only on local markets. We need a balance. We need both markets. We need the local market as well as the international markets to get to the full potential of our agriculture and agro-processing sector. Talking about agricultural processing and agro-processing, this was a sector that we also flagged in the National Development Plan. And I think it's very important to realize, when we talked about the 1 million jobs in the National Development Plan, the agriculture, the agro-processing sector actually contributes 1/3 of those jobs. Over 350,000 jobs that can be created in the agro-processing sector. These are value-added jobs. Typically, higher wages can be earned in this sector. How do we create a highly competitive sector? And a lot of times, these are actually the components or the food items that are still being imported, where some of that production can actually be, the imports can be replaced, and we can produce a lot of that produce or the food items in the domestic market. But it requires very specific targeted intervention and also major investments. We're talking here large-scale operations on the formal side. If I think about soybeans, for example, expansion of 2 million tons of crushing capacity in the last 6 to 8 years. Without that investment, we wouldn't have seen the growth in the soybean industry. That's on the formal side. On the informal side, I think we have very little knowledge of how these informal value chains work. How do they support our rural base? For example, we recently completed a study for the Pork Producers Organization, where we scanned through what the pig herd looks like. And from piecing different pieces of information, putting it all together, we came up with the numbers. 1.4 million pigs are in the formal herd. A staggering 890,000 pigs are in the informal herd. If you convert that, and we researched those little pig units, 10 pigs or less in households, if you calculate the economic value of that informal market, which is getting to about 23,000 jobs equivalent on a minimum wage base that is created in this informal market. I'm just mentioning this one example because it gives us a feeling that we really don't have an understanding for these informal chains. So to summarize, we've got 3 pillars of growth. There's a spatial element that we can add, or that we have to add to this growth. We understand what the markets look like. We understand where infrastructure needs to be created. It all needs to be put together in a master plan. In other words, so what does an agriculture master plan mean in practice? It cannot only be another plan on paper. It needs to be a plan that actually is where there's execution, where there's buy-in, where we actually do move forward. We have very specific targeted interventions. And these interventions need to be specific enough where you have clear guidelines on who's going to do what, typically like a business plan. In other words, you're sitting around a table, you have your stakeholders, you've got your industry, you've got government, and you've got labor. And you agree on facts. This needs to be an empirically based, a fact-driven exercise. And then you negotiate and you make compromises and you understand what will we as a country need, we as an agriculture sector and agro-processing sector require to grow and to find the future where we actually have an inclusive economy, something that we've been dreaming of for a long time. And the principles are clearly set out in the National Development Plan, where we have already talked about the 3 pillars of growth. Those are still relevant. The basic principles are still relevant over all these years. The only benefit that we currently have is that we have a number of success cases, both on the government side as well as private sector side. We have a number of examples of very productive and very good initiatives, public-private partnerships that are really working well. We have good examples where with a good collaboration between industry and government, we have opened up export markets. So these examples are all there. We need to use them and we need to multiply them and grow them faster. We need scale on most of these initiatives. We are worried about our budgets. The country is running into a major budget deficit. We have COVID-19 affecting the economy severely. But what we need to do in this opportunity, see the opportunity in this situation that we're currently sitting to work together and to really understand the urgency of moving into action. In other words, not just having a plan. The Agriculture Master Plan will hopefully produce this business plan orientated execution of specific interventions. We cannot do everything. We cannot focus on all the sectors all at once. What we need to do is do deep dive value chain work, where we understand at each node what is required, what does each stakeholder require, agree on that, assign the responsibility to it, and then drive it. Get the people who can really make a difference into the sector and let the sector grow to its fullest potential, what the natural resources can support in South Africa, but also what the global market can offer us in terms of opportunities. In other words, to conclude, we're looking at a model where we are looking at local markets, and I'm talking here informal and formal, rural areas and cities. So in other words, a spatialized approach where you can layer information, where you understand where does infrastructure where do we need to invest in infrastructure, where can we boost production, where do we have consumption hubs. All of this can be spatialized, integrated and modeled for the local market. Then we can look at export markets and see how much more growth can we gain in export markets. We won't achieve sufficient growth by focusing only on the local market and the local economy. We have to look outside as well, and that's where also a significant amount of potential is. We believe in growth in the agriculture sector in South Africa, and we believe that this growth and the prosperous future of the sector lies in partnerships and in working together and making contributions, but also making sacrifices and negotiating a common ground for the sector at large.